The Enlightenment was certainly a great period of history between 1740 and 1780. It has also been called the Age of Reason. It was unprecedented in that it presented, at least in this era, a focus on a particular set of values, attitudes, and beliefs shared by prominent writers, artists, thinkers of that period. The Enlightenment has a few key characteristics, but the main one that comes to mind is the prioritization of reason and of rationality, and especially of empirical observation in the scientific method, as giving true knowledge, objective knowledge, but also bringing about greater human happiness. Not only that, but there was an emphasis on learning and knowledge as a whole. And furthermore, the emphasis of breaking away from traditions and pre modern religions which may have been considered as irrational or superstitious in nature. A pertinent quote in this regard is, and I quote, "What a change there was between 1785 and 1824. There's probably never been such an abrupt revolution in habits, ideas, and beliefs in the 2000 years since we have known the history of the world." Of course, some criticisms of the Enlightenment have also been laid out, in that the Enlightenment may have falsely accused pre-modern religions of being irrational and of having presented this kind of caricature of pre-modern religion as something irrational and superstitious, and it may ignore the rational basis for tradition, for example. And completely throwing out tradition may not be a good thing either. Furthermore, after the Enlightenment, metaphysics and philosophy was generally degraded and the natural sciences took the pedestal. An issue that may arise with that is that without a sound philosophical and metaphysical foundation from which to understand the world, the scientific project may not be successful in the first place, because the natural sciences are based upon the assumptions that classical metaphysics and philosophy may give us. And in fact, without a philosophical, epistemological, and metaphysical worldview under which the natural sciences can operate, the scientific project cannot work in the first place. However, the Enlightenment was important as it pointed out many of the irrational aspects of certain pre-modern traditions, and some of its criticisms of organized religion up until that point may have been very valid. And furthermore, the emphasis on reason, even if in some instances they may have falsely accused pre-modern traditions or religion of being irrational, but overall this emphasis on reason is a good thing, as it allows society to prosper more and it allows for more intellectual and scientific breakthroughs. So there is some nuance to this. There are many positives and there are some negatives. And it's very important for people not to take the Enlightenment project as, just a given good. Rather, they should be critical of the Enlightenment project. Indeed, it's a intellectual project like all the other intellectual projects throughout human history. We should acknowledge its good and try and consider, reevaluate, and be critical of its downsides or its weaknesses. There are different varieties of the Enlightenment, and this depends fundamentally on the various national, social, and political contexts in which the Enlightenment. Of course, the Enlightenment project is fundamentally based within the sort of context of each nation. As the Enlightenment project spread from one country to another, it defined a pan-European consciousness of great force. Of course, the specific flavor it took on was very different. In France, the opposition to the Catholic churches was much greater. However, in England, interestingly enough, because first of all, the tradition, the English, the sort of Anglo-speaking tradition, developed an emphasis on the rule of law, but at the same time on the trajectory of the English tradition had been such that it had emphasized individual liberty and individual rights. Couple that with the emphasis on rule of law in the English tradition meant that there had generally, gradually over time, been greater religious tolerance within legislation, and generally speaking, the society of the English people was more tolerant, and the religious establishment was generally seen as less oppressive. Henceforth, why in England the Enlightenment may have taken on less of a clear cut anti religious sort of character. At its peak, from let's say the 1760s to the early 1770s. Whoever wants to see more information about the development of the English tradition, they can consult works such as Dr. Carroll Quigley's Tragedy and Hope or the Oxford Illustrated History of Britain. In essence, the Enlightenment was the belief that the expansion of knowledge, the application of reason, and dedication to the scientific method would result in the greater progress or happiness of mankind. This outlook was reformist, humanitarian, and buoyant. The archetypal Enlightenment thinker considered the world as ultimately rational and beneficent. Nature, including humanity, is essentially good, and people have potential to improve themselves and thereby improve the world as a whole and make it a better place. Dr. Carroll Quigley notes regarding the Western tradition that the development and trajectory it had gone under through the sort of centuries meant that it had become a humanitarian tradition which considered, which was very much emphasizing the rights of individuals and individualism. And furthermore, the 19th century, as noted by Dr. Carroll Quigley, in the Western world, was one marked by increasing emphasis on individual rights and the assumption that the world was fundamentally, in essence, a good place and a rational place, and that we were working towards a utopic world and the world was becoming increasingly better over time. Of course, events such as World War One and World War Two shattered those beliefs and by extension shattered the confidence within the Western tradition. But up until that point, so from the Enlightenment up until let's say World War One, this was kind of the dominant view within Western societies at the time. One major factor for the Enlightenment was the discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton. This was as the natural world could be explored and discovered, and it was governed by underlying laws. All things in the natural world thus have an explanation according to this worldview. We only need to try and seek it and find out what exactly those laws are. So this impetus to study, observe, and figure out the world led to this kind of Enlightenment philosophy and attitude. One very crucial work within this arena was the French Encyclopedie. This was published in Paris. It consists of 28 volumes and 11 additional volumes of illustrations. The main editor of this work was Denis Diderot, who passed away in the year 1784 and was born in the year 1713. He was assisted in the early stages by Jean d'Alembert, who was born in the year 1717 and passed away in the year 1783. It's written in this work that the aim of an encyclopedia is to bring together the knowledge scattered over the face of the earth, to present its overall structure to our contemporaries, and to hand it onto those who will come after us, so that our children, by becoming more knowledgeable, will become more virtuous and happier, and so that we shall not die without earning the gratitude of the human race. This reflected the common Enlightenment attitudes that all knowledge was good in itself, and furthermore, as quoted by Genzier, that all things must be examined, debated, investigated, without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings. The encyclopedists were philosophers, were philosophes rather, a group of loose-knit, like-minded individuals. They were cultivated, sociable, lively writers. And like has been mentioned, their aim was to compile all of human knowledge thus far that had been observed, discovered, and developed until that time into one encyclopedia.